Welcome to the Robert Wenzel Show. Please stand by for Robert Wenzel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Robert Wenzel Show. I'm Robert Wenzel. Today, my guest is Judge Andrew Napolitano. He is the senior judicial analyst for the Fox News Channel, where he provides on-air legal, political, and economic analysis. He is the youngest life-tenured Superior Court judge in New Jersey history and is a nationally recognized expert on U.S. constitutional law and human freedom. Judge Napolitano is the author of several books, and we've got him on the show today to discuss his most recent book, Theodore and Woodrow. Judge, welcome to the show.
Bob, it's a pleasure to be on with you, my friend, and thank you for having me.
Sure. I'm glad you could join us. We're talking about Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. You think they were both bad guys. Why?
Well, it's not a question of what I think. It's a question of what history has revealed to us and how history has been perverted by the progressive era which they commenced. First of all, each were president of the United States. They ran against each other. They hated each other. They only met in public, so far as we know, once in their joint lives. They came from different backgrounds, but they both expressed this perverse view that the Constitution does not mean what it says, that the federal government is not one of limited powers, that the Constitution authorizes the federal government to do whatever it wants to do for whatever reason it offers, so long as that particular reason or that particular thing that it wants to do is not expressly prohibited by the Constitution. Now, that's not just an academic argument. That is the opposite of what every single one, even the big government among the framers, every single one of the framers, including Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, stated was the purpose of the Constitution. It is contrary to the plain meaning of the Constitution. And with the exception of the Civil War era, when the country was run by a dictator called Abraham Lincoln, it's contrary to the general trend of the movement of government from the time of George Washington up to the time of the progressive era. Under their theory, and it's a theory that has played out today, I would argue the theory reached culmination in the re-election of Barack Obama last week. The federal government can right any wrong and regulate any behavior and tax any event. Sound familiar?
Yeah, it sure does. You know, I'm beginning to think, the more and more I think about this, Judge, I'm wondering if the Founding Fathers, with the Constitution, went too far by creating lawmaking bodies and a president that have so much power in the sense that they can make laws, they can change laws. Why couldn't they have done it something along the lines of live and let live and leave it at that and make it nearly impossible to change laws?
I don't think the Founding Fathers, and of course I can't get in their heads, but I don't think from reading their works, the Founding Fathers anticipated the growth of government of this magnitude. I think that they, to a person, had they been around, would have sided with the South in the war between the states, that the Union was a voluntary one, and if you voluntarily entered, you could voluntarily leave. And I think that that was a check on the power of the federal government, which they felt confident was always there. It wasn't until the war between the states, when Lincoln directly or indirectly causes the death of about 800,000 human beings, that this belief that they had in the government they created was dissolved because of the use of force against those who simply wanted to be left alone and wanted lawfully to undo what their predecessors had lawfully done. So I don't think we can blame them. We need to blame Lincoln, and we need to blame the passage of time. I mean, Jefferson predicted in the long march of history, the government grows and individuals weaken. Jefferson thought that the remedy for that would be periodic bloodshed. Unfortunately, the major bloodshed in our history brings the government in the wrong direction. It brings it towards an authoritarian government rather than a smaller one, and one that respects individual freedom. I don't blame the framers. In retrospect, would I have written the Constitution this way? No, I would make some changes to assure that the things that have happened to us today didn't happen. But the significance of my book is that the first 20 years of the 20th century, we're talking about around 1900 to around 1920, bring about such a fundamental structural change between the federal government and individuals that the government and American life would never be the same again. I mean, in those 20 years, we have institutionalized racism on the part of the federal government. Wilson and Roosevelt are nativists, and they are racists. They hate Jews, Italians, Catholics, blacks, anybody with skin darker than theirs. They take what was then an integrated military and an integrated federal government, and they segregate it. They send a signal to the southern states that Jim Crow laws and persecution of African Americans is acceptable because the federal government will not do anything to interfere. They give themselves a printing press in the form of the Federal Reserve. They give themselves a spigot of cash in the form of the amendment that arguably permits a federal income tax. And they tell people they can't drink alcohol because they know how everybody should live. They give us a Food and Drug Administration, which is nowhere authorized in the Constitution. And they begin the welfare and the regulatory state. The welfare state is giving cash to individuals and stimulus packages to corporations. They were railroads, who were owned by the richest people in the country, who hardly needed free land. They could afford to buy whatever they needed for their railroads. And they start the dependency of large groups of people on the federal government. That dependency, of course, is greatly enhanced by FDR, is again magnified by LBJ. By the time LBJ magnifies that dependency, FDR added Social Security, LBJ, Medicare, and Medicaid. The Republicans are onto this scheme, and instead of resisting it, they join it. They recognize, you know what, this works. When you promise people cash and you give them the cash, whether you extract it from other taxpayers or whether you borrow it in their name, they vote for you. And it proves the wisdom of something else Jefferson said, which is when the people recognize that the public treasury has become a public trough, they will begin to send to Washington only those who will promise to deliver some of this pie back home. And that's where we are today, where the receivers are almost 50%. And those from whom it is taken or in whose name it is taken will soon be under 50%. And this sort of institutionalized dependence that the progressives wanted will culminate in a numerical victory for them every election year that they rear their heads.
So do you see any hope for America? How do you see this playing out?
Well, if we keep on where we're doing now, where our entitlements are $1.5 trillion, our debt service is another half to $0.7 trillion. That's the $2.2 trillion that the government collects in taxes.
Right.
Everything else the government spends, it has to borrow. I mean, sooner or later, the government will run into other people's money. It won't be able to borrow money, and it won't be able to print money because it will be worthless. Mm-hmm. So that will lead, unfortunately, to violence, to riots in the street. And that will lead either to secession, and people will form mini countries, maybe with a few states here and a few states there, or regrettably, it will lead, like most revolutions do, to a tyrant. And then the tyrant will be deposed and we'll have some freedom. But I don't want to go through that. All they have to do is follow the Constitution.
Right.
Ron Paul's one of the few people in the Congress who understands this and who's willing to say, no, you don't cut the diseased tail off the puppy dog snip by snip. You cut it off all at once, otherwise the dog will die. The entitlement state has to stop. I'm not suggesting my 87-year-old parents should be denied their Social Security and be put out in the streets, but I am saying that their 20-something grandchildren should be told this program's not available for you, we're not doing this anymore, and you can keep your own money and invest it however you want. So it'll take a couple generations to unwind this. Is there the political will for that? Probably not. If there were, we'd be preparing for the inauguration of President Paul.
Right. Now, when Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson implemented their policies, were they doing it on philosophical ideals, or was it power, money? What caused them to push in the direction they...
I think it was probably everything. I mean, initially, progressivism came with a smiling face. It was, we'll pay your bills for you. We'll make the Senate more democratic, lowercase d, by taking control of it away from state legislatures. So when they give away cash and when people accept cash, and when entities accept free land, they forget that this comes with federal strings. The strings for individuals is dependence. and the strings for the corporations is a false sense of income, a false view of the market, that this cash will always be there. Of course, it's 100 years later, but all those railroads are now bankrupt, the ones that the federal government gave free land to.
Right.
They don't exist anymore. In the case of changing the way we choose senators, I don't know if they wanted to destroy the sovereignty of the states. I don't know if they realized that would be the intended or unintended consequence of what they did. But by making senators popularly elected, but making the Senate just a smaller, richer, less frequently elected version of the House of Representatives, they removed the sovereignty of the states. I mean, think about Obamacare. 26 states sued to invalidate it. Well, that's more than half the union. That would be 52 senators if they had been sent by the state legislatures who filed those lawsuits. Therefore, Obamacare wouldn't have passed under the original construction of the government. And the original construction of the government was actually a compromise, but it was brilliant. It was that at the federal table, there'd be a representative for the nation as a whole, the president, for the people in the country, the House of Representatives, and for the sovereign states, the Senate. The sovereign states, not the people in those states, but the governments of them, would send people to the United States Senate. I often or have argued, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that if any part of the Constitution is unconstitutional, it's the 16th Amendment, because it so radically alters. And you have to study this to perceive it. It doesn't look like it alters it, but it has when you read Supreme Court cases where the federal government has taken over so many things that the states used to do. It so radically alters the structure of the federal government as to remove the check and balance that the state governments were to have. Not only could the states leave, since they voluntarily entered, they voluntarily could leave. We talked about that earlier. Mm-hmm. But they could direct the senators whom they had sent to the Senate not to permit the federal government to do what it wanted to do. I mean, a Theodore Roosevelt or an FDR today would actually be more powerful than they were in the old days, because like Barack Obama, they can get half the country dependent upon the federal government and be guaranteed of their votes. That would not have been possible. That would not have been possible, Bob, in an era where state legislatures chose members of the Senate.
Yeah. Okay, Judge, I know you have to go in a minute. I just want to ask you one more question about these petitions for secession that we're seeing show up. Do you think they'll get anywhere? Obviously, probably not, but do you think it's important just from a publicity point of view that this kind of idea is getting out there?
It's important also from a political point of view. I mean, if the Congress, for example, were terrified that a constitutional convention was about to be called, let's say 33 states called for it, and we need 36, they might very well start clipping their own sails for fear that a constitutional convention would produce a document which, if ratified by the states, would put the Congress out of existence. The same thing might happen with secession. If somebody like Governor Perry, for example, who has the strongest argument because Texas entered the Union under an express agreement with the Congress, I know it was before the Civil War, but it was a validly enacted law that's never been invalidated, that it could leave when it wants to, or it could split into 5 different states. If that looks like it might actually happen, if there is public sentiment in favor of it, I think it'll scare the Congress to death, and you might see votes going in a different direction. Bob, I've enjoyed very much speaking with you. I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate letting you talk at great length about the book.
Sure, it's a very valuable book. I've got one more question. Are we going to see Judge Napolitano 2016 for president?
Probably not.
Okay.
It's not in the cards, but hopefully we'll see somebody more faithful to the Constitution than the folks that ran last time. I'm not criticizing Gary Johnson. He just didn't have the money or even the legal ability, because he wasn't on all the ballots, because they wouldn't let him debate, to rival Romney and Obama. But maybe things like that will change, and Rand Paul will be in the White House. That would be just as good, and maybe even better, than a Judge Napolitano. Thank you, Bob. Okay. Thanks very much. God bless you.
We'll put you down for the Supreme Court. Thank you very much, Judge. We've been talking to Judge Andrew Napolitano, his book, Theodore and Woodrow, How Two American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom. It just carries on from what the judge talked about here. Well worth reading. The book has just been released this week, and there'll be a link to it at my website. Okay, well, that was a great interview with Judge Napolitano. Now I bring Online, Chris Rossini, who's finally dried his clothes off the coast of New Jersey somewhere, or on the coast of New Jersey. Chris, welcome to the Wrap-Up with Rossini.
Thank you, Bob, very much. I'm glad we got the shows going again. We had a little hiatus, but it's great to be back. And what a guest to start with.
Everything's okay as far as your location and all that? You're fine, and
Yes.
You're not sleeping under the starlights or anything like that?
No. Fortunately, I have a roof over my head, food on the table, everything is great, and my house is safe too, so thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so what did you think of the judge's interview or comments?
Great, as you would expect from the judge. He had some solid constitutional points. He's definitely in the same camp I put him as a Ron Paul. He's so well educated, so well spoken, well known too. I would love to see him on that presidential ticket because this country would be in much better shape with people on solid ground like he is, taking us forward.
Right. Just to let our readers know, before the show went on, you and I were discussing on the Judge Napolitano, Tom Woods ticket. I think I would go out and vote for that.
Yeah.
I've never voted in a presidential election and really have no plans to, but if it was Napolitano Woods, I would consider it.
Yes, me too. Me too, absolutely.
Let's keep tossing that out there and sort of get that going. But getting back to the judge, I mean, clearly he's a constitutionalist. He believes in the Constitution. He's familiar with the Constitution, knows what the Founding Fathers intended when they wrote the Constitution. But as I've been putting in more and more of my posts, I think the problem really is that the Constitution just creates these lawmakers. And when you have lawmakers, they're going to make laws. I mean, you got 200-something plus or whatever it is in Congress, and you've got a president who is supposed to carry out these laws, and they get out of control. If the law was the non-aggression principle, which basically includes respect for private property, I think then it makes it much more difficult if you can't change anything. And I defy anyone to bring a problem to me that cannot be resolved under the non-aggression principle in respect for private property. If you respect private property and you're not aggressing, then you can do whatever the hell you want. And if you're aggressing against someone, well, then others have a right to stop you. So I don't see what laws need to be changed ever. Just apply consistently the non-aggression principle.
Yes. As much as it pains me to maybe disagree with the judge, I don't think that it's possible to write a constitution that can't be disregarded, thrown away. Even who he mentions in his book, Theodore Roosevelt, clearly disregarded the Constitution, and all the way up until today, the Constitution means nothing. And it's because when you have that type of personality and power to steal, the power to take lives, drawing up rules for him, it ends up being a joke.
Right, exactly. In my view, it's the fact that laws can be changed. We don't need lawmakers. We need one law that is basically the non-aggression principle, which I would promote as the live and let live law. You know, Hayek warns us that the masses are never thinking theoretically. They don't have the temperament to be philosophers as to how things should be ruled. They're just sold one concept or another, and they run with it and stick with it. And mostly it's been patriotism, which really leads to tyranny, and different welfare systems, which also lead to tyranny and problems. But if we promote live and let live, it's something the masses can sort of understand and buy. If they can just understand that simple principle, live and let live, and then sort of get on a gut level how that applies, then maybe we have a chance of getting liberty. But unfortunately, I think the judge is right about we're heading in a totally different direction where riots could occur, where the possibility of a dictator results, and then after the dictator we may get some freedom. But that's a long ride. Who knows how long dictatorships will last? I'm actually, for my speech that's coming up at the Mises Institute, I'm studying and doing a lot of research on the Soviet Union because I just want to understand how it developed, how it was able to survive, and then what really caused the crash. I think that's really important to know what caused the breakup of the Soviet Union, because we're heading in that direction. It'll be different as far as the specifics and won't be exactly like the Soviet Union. I'm talking about a totalitarian system now, but we're heading in that direction. So it's really, really important to understand what really caused the breakup, and for the large part, how peaceful it was. I mean, there wasn't a lot of bloodshed. It just fell apart. And maybe that's the collapse. I'm titling my speech, "The Magnificent Collapse of the Soviet Union," because I see it that way. There was very little bloodshed. It's not a perfect collapse. I mean, they don't have perfect freedom there, but they're much better off than where they were under Soviet regime rule. And maybe there are some lessons there. I'm doing the research now to find out and see how they might apply to a future totalitarian United States, and how we could get out of a totalitarian United States without much bloodshed.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that speech. It's in March at the Mises Institute.
Right.
And if you look back in history, the empires, once they tip over, it's like dominoes, whether it was the Spanish, the British, or the Soviet Union, how all the different countries, they break apart. Perhaps we can have that here with the states, each breaking apart. There's already chatter now about secession. I don't know how serious it is. Probably not. But, when the federal government can no longer help you, it'll get way more serious.
Right.
So, as little war and bloodshed as possible to get out of this mess would be ideal.
Right. Okay, that concludes Wrap Up with Rossini. Thanks, Chris. We'll talk to you next week.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to The Robert Wenzel Show. This is Robert Wenzel. Be sure to check out my website, economicpolicyjournal.com, where I blog 7 days a week about economics, finance, politics, and liberty. Executive producer of The Robert Wenzel Show is Chris Rossini. Head of editing and mastering is John Daubert.